Alexander the Great, one of the most extraordinary and enigmatic warriors of all time. At the age of 30, he was ruler of one of the largest empires ever known. From the olive groves of Greece to the dusty palaces of India, Alexander brought East and West together and forever changed the ancient world.
He's a wise man, he's a murderer, he's a psychopath, he's a genius. Alexander is everything. He's all these things, and perhaps none of them as well.
Join us on a quest to find what drove Alexander to conquer distant lands. Was he a military genius or a bloodthirsty tyrant? His deeds are legendary. But in the end, did a power-crazed Alexander become his own most dangerous enemy? Babylon, June 323 BC. Alexander lies dangerously ill, his body racked with fever. After 20,000 miles of bloodshed and conquest, his pursuit of eternal glory is finally at an end. Alexander's men gather anxiously around his bedside. The historian Plutarch describes the scene. Nothing could keep them from seeing him a last time, and the motive at almost every heart was grief and a sort of helpless bewilderment at the thought of losing their king. Within hours, one of the world's greatest warrior kings would be dead. What led to his untimely death at 32? How was the conqueror finally conquered? To find some answers, we must retrace his remarkable story. Alexander was born here in Pella, in northern Greece, in 356 BC. The golden age of Greece had long passed. The empire was now a weak collection of torn and divided city-states. Easy prey for Alexander's father, Philip. King Philip was a rough, womanizing soldier. He was a heavy drinker, a fierce fighter, and the idol of his battle-scarred troops. His army was one of the best in the ancient world. But Philip was also a ruthless politician. He created the state of Macedonia by taming the region's unruly tribes.
To my mind, Philip's achievement was obviously overwhelming, the most underestimated man in antiquity who balanced the army, a military genius. Quite extraordinary.
With diplomacy and brute force, Philip went on to conquer most of Greece. From his father, Alexander learned military skill and leadership. But his mother, Olympias, also was a powerful influence. From her, he inherited his passionate and emotional nature.
Her influence on Alexander will have been immense. She was a powerful woman, very, one might almost say, mystical.
Olympias was a follower of religious cults, particularly the cult of Dionysus, the god of wine and passion. She is rumored to have worshipped the god by dancing with wild abandon and by falling into strange trances.
In a way, Olympias was just as impressive and intimidating as her husband. She was highly intelligent, politically astute, and tough as nails. She had a proprietary attitude towards her son, undoubtedly loved him very deeply, but was there as his sentinel, protecting his vested interests.
Olympias spread a rumor that she had been impregnated by Zeus, the king of the gods in the form of a snake. Throughout his life, Alexander would be fascinated by the thought he could be more than mortal. If his mother and father had a strong impact on the young boy, so did his teacher, the famous Greek philosopher Aristotle. Through him, Alexander learned the wonders of Greek culture, especially the great mythic tales. Aristotle inspired a love of Homer's Iliad, the story of the Trojan Wars. At its heart lie the heroes, whose epic strength and great deeds earn them power and fame. One of those heroes is Achilles, the archetypal Greek warrior. Offered the choice between a long, ordinary life or a brief burst of glory on the battlefield, Achilles chose an early death and eternal fame.
It would be very hard, I think, to underestimate the extent of Achilles' influence on Alexander. He was his ancestor, as he believed, mythically, on his mother's side. And from a very young age, I think, Alexander perceived that Achilles was the sort of role model that someone like him, who aimed always to be best and among the first, as Homer puts it, should take on. And I mean take on in two senses: assume the characteristics of, but also rival. So whatever Achilles could do, Alexander could do better.
Alexander left home to study with Aristotle for 3 years. When he returned at age 16, his other role model, his father, King Philip, had remarried. Worse, another son was born, threatening Alexander's position as successor to the throne. This made Alexander angry and resentful. The two quarreled violently.
This may well have embittered Alexander and started that very difficult atmosphere, which I actually think is cross-cultural, a universal psychological trait, if it comes into play, of deep rivalry of a son desperately wanting to outdo father.
The feud between father and son got so intense, Alexander went into exile. Ultimately, the two reconciled, but the truce did not last long. On a summer night in 336 BC, Philip and the royal family gathers to celebrate the marriage of his daughter. The king pauses at the entrance to greet the crowds. A man darts forward and inflicts a mortal blow. Philip died instantly. The murderer was killed on the spot before torture could reveal accomplices in high places. Did he act alone, or were there others conspiring along with him? Some historians believe the murder could have been arranged by Alexander's cunning mother, Olympias. After all, she'd been cast aside for a younger woman.
I would have thought that she's involved. I mean, heavens, this was what displaced her from a position of honor. She's not going to just sit there quietly. Hell hath no fury, even in Macedonia, like a woman scorned.
And what about Alexander? Could he have had a role in his father's death?
In terms of for whom or for whose benefit was Philip's assassination most strongly pronounced, the answer must be Alexander, because Philip, at the time of his assassination, was about to go off to Asia, was about to begin this great campaign of conquest. Alexander wasn't even part of the story. He was going to be left behind, presumably as a regent, but he was not going to be able to get the sort of glory that comes with being on this major campaign.
And glory was the one thing Alexander wanted above all else. Any suspicion would have angered the Macedonian nobles, whose support he needed and got. At just 20 years old, Alexander was made king. When he ascended the throne, Alexander inherited a great army, but much political unrest. It took him a year to quell a rebellion in Greece and solidify his rule. But Alexander wasn't content with Macedonia. His growing impatience and his ambition made him thirst for more. He set his sights on the Greeks' longtime enemy, the Persians. The Persian Empire stretched from modern-day Turkey to Pakistan. 150 years before, the Persians had burned the city of Athens and destroyed her temples. This war crime was never forgotten. Alexander's father, Philip, was planning to invade Persia before his death. Now Alexander would have his shot at revenge.
I would run with the line that Alexander's manic ambition is fueled as a response to his father's enormous success. He is a spark struck off Philip, and it's a very, very powerful, more than a spark, it's a devouring flame.
This devouring flame came close to consuming Alexander. Throughout his short life, Philip would haunt him, driving him to greater and greater feats in an effort to prove he was good enough, or perhaps even better than his father. With the ghost of Philip, Alexander sets out on the path of glory. In 334 BC, Alexander crosses the Hellespont with his army. He begins an 11-year journey of unparalleled conquest and ambition that would forever reshape the ancient world. His first stop, the fallen walls of Troy, to pay tribute to his childhood hero Achilles. Like the great mythic battle for Troy, Alexander is preparing for his own epic battle. His opponent? One of the richest and most powerful men on earth, King Darius III. The Persian monarch has no idea of the force he is up against. Alexander has been left a golden legacy by his father, one of the ancient world's best trained and most disciplined armies. Even more than Philip, the young king is a charismatic and inspiring leader.
I think the secret to Alexander's military genius is that he's extremely decisive, he's bold, and he seems fearless to the point of being reckless at times. That he never seems to hesitate to go dashing off into the action.
The invaders march south to Issus in modern-day Turkey. Alexander's troops are outnumbered by Darius's army. But this is exactly the kind of challenge Alexander relishes.
Alexander's ability to adapt is really the mark of a great general. Greatest generals in military history are able to do that. He was able to see the situation in a sweep of the eye and then come up with a plan that would overcome the obstacles that would stymie any other commander.
Alexander quickly sizes up his enemy. The infantry are protected by archers, a sure sign Darius has no faith in his foot soldiers. Alexander makes his first move, using one of the most powerful weapons in his arsenal, the weapon of fear.
They're not watchers of drama for nothing. Utterly terrifying. They'd clash their shields, spears would move from side to side, and they'd walk forwards for the final bit with the incredible, chilling, endless roar of "Ah-la-la-la-la! As they came up, terrifying.
Alexander charges into the river and up the opposite bank. In the ensuing chaos, the Persian left flank collapses. In an almost photographic image, this monumental battle is captured in a mosaic from Pompeii. It is presumed to be a faithful copy of a painting from the late 4th century BC. When Alexander finally comes face to face with his nemesis Darius, he first spears Darius's bodyguard. All around Alexander are Persian soldiers filled with terror and fear. Faced with an unstoppable avenger, Darius flees.
Well, when the Persian army sees its king, the great king, Shah, running away like that, what are the rest of them to think? There's an incredible psychological impact of that kind of a moment upon the Persians. And as soon as that happens, the battle is won.
Still, Alexander is ruthless. By the end of the day, more than 50,000 Persians lay dead.
There's no doubt Alexander loved killing. His favourite daily pursuit is hunting. And here we're talking about real hunting. He goes in alone, unarmoured, against lions. Gosh, heavens, can you imagine it? It's just to keep fit for the days when he's attacking men.
But behind this bloodthirsty killer is a cunning mind. Alexander, like any modern-day politician, understands the importance of image and publicity. He is determined to become a legend in his own time. On the campaign, he brings along his own personal historian and paid spin doctor, Callisthenes.
Callisthenes' role in Alexander's campaign was to act as the publicity agent, the official PR representative. And it seems fairly clear that as Alexander marched along, what Callisthenes was doing was sort of pounding out these reports from the front. So he was kind of like the embedded journalist for Alexander's campaign.
After the Battle of Issus, Alexander and his army advanced down the coast of modern-day Lebanon. Most cities surrendered, but the island of Tyre resists.
Alexander's attitude toward defiance was either join me or die.
Alexander begins what would become the longest and most brutal siege of his campaign. After 7 grueling months, when the walls are finally breached, 7,000 Tyrians are killed and 30,000 enslaved. To prove a point to other cities that might resist, he has 2,000 Tyrian fighters crucified.
When he was finished, he allowed the bloodlust of his men to run loose and killed virtually every male inhabitant of the fortress. It was an awful display of brutality, but it was also very effective in showing to any other potential enemies what could happen if they resisted.
In another savage siege, this time at Gaza, Alexander's army kills every man in the city.
From a military perspective, he did everything right, or nearly everything. And there's so much to emulate in his generalship. But there was a dark side to Alexander as well. And he was brutal, and he fought for glory. And many of the things that we would consider the worst traits of humanity were manifest in Alexander as well.
Alexander is merciful if his enemies surrender, but cruel if he is opposed. The governor of Gaza, Battus, is defiant to the bitter end. Alexander reveals his cruel side when he punishes Battus. He has him tied with rope, dragged around the city until he dies. It is a familiar scene taken from the pages of Homer's Iliad. Achilles has his arch-rival Hector dragged around the walls of Troy. But in that version, Hector was already dead.
Alexander was brutal. He refined the art of brutality to the highest level. And that is what created his success in many cases. He could not have conquered the way he did had he not resorted to brutal tactics.
With a string of savage victories under his belt, Alexander is ready to take on Egypt, one of the greatest empires the world has ever seen. The Egyptian pharaohs were seen as living gods and built massive pyramids, temples, and monuments as testaments to their glory. If the Greeks were dazzled by Egyptian culture, Alexander was even more impressed, and obsessed by the notion that a great ruler could also be a god. After 2 years of warfare, Alexander marches inland to Memphis. The Egyptians are eager to see their Persian rulers defeated. They surrender without a fight and welcome Alexander with open arms. Welcome Alexander with open arms. Under his rule, Egypt's religious and cultural practices are still allowed. In return, the Egyptian priests give Alexander the title of Pharaoh. It marks a profound turning point. For it is here that Alexander began to believe he was truly a living god. In 331 BC, Alexander sets off on an epic journey to visit the oracle at Siwa. He is seeking proof of his divine existence.
It was about 300 miles. The approach to Siwa would have been on a plateau, relatively flat land, but sand dunes all around. The oracle was a well-known destination. There would have been a path, but the path could easily become obscured. You would have a situation where you would have searing heat during the day, incredible cold at night. A sandstorm could come up very quickly where you couldn't see your hand in front of your face.
Alexander and his men do become lost after a terrible sandstorm. But legend has it that two birds saved them by guiding the group to their destination, the extraordinary oasis of Siwa and the temple of Zeus Ammon.
Well, that visit to the oracle, this is one of the most fascinating episodes really in the whole history of the ancient world. I think the question is, had Alexander in some way already masterminded a bit of a publicity exercise that he was the son of Zeus?
Alexander enters the temple alone while his men wait outside.
Here we have Alexander. He's a young man in his early 20s. He's already accomplished incredible things. And he's in a place where suddenly he's being treated, at least by the native Egyptians, as a god on earth. And you have to ask yourself, what is he thinking? And he's certainly a long way from Macedonia at this point.
Alexander came out of the temple. They all rushed forward and said, "Alexander, Alexander, what did you ask?" And he said, "I'm not saying that." He said, "But we heard him call you the son of Zeus." He said, "All right, you can go with that story if you want." And it became then publicized by his publicist, and Alexander was allowed this version of his identity to spread because it, I think, picked up with previous suspicions on his part, possibly beginning from the stories of his mother, that he was somehow more than human.
From then on, Alexander's loyal scribe Callisthenes would call his master a god on earth. And the Egyptians would reaffirm that notion, depicting his image on some of the most sacred temple walls. At Luxor, Alexander is shown with raised hands, worshipping his divine father, the god Ammon.
Being a deity, he was immune from criticism. He was on a different plane, a different plateau, and far superior.
But being a pharaoh, a living god, is not enough for Alexander. He is determined to defeat his archenemy Darius once and for all. While Alexander has been in Egypt, Darius has been amassing another army to take him on. In October 331 BC, one of the most decisive battles in history is fought in the heat and dust of Gaugamela, Persia, north of modern-day Baghdad. This time, Alexander is outnumbered more than 3-1. But he thrives on danger, and the challenge only seems to embolden him more. His men are almost completely surrounded by the Persian army, but his flanks hold the enemy long enough to see a gap open in the Persian lines. Alexander seizes the moment and breaks through to attack Darius. The Persian king flees once again. One of the secrets of Alexander's success on the battlefield is his use of the phalanx, a 16-deep formation of soldiers carrying long spears.
Alexander used a hammer and anvil technique with his phalanxes. His own phalanx, his Macedonian infantry, would form the anvil. And against the anvil, he would crush the enemy phalanx using the hammer, which is his companion cavalry. So the hammer and anvil was really a technique that he used time and again to be successful in battle.
Darius, who has fled east into the mountains, is eventually murdered by one of his officers. Three years after landing at Troy, Alexander is proclaimed Lord of Asia. He'd accomplished what his father planned to do but could not. While other great leaders would have been content with this monumental triumph, Alexander isn't. There is no turning back. In 329 BC, Alexander pushes on toward Afghanistan to conquer the eastern edge of the Persian Empire. Now he faces an even greater challenge, the forbidding mountains of the Hindu Kush. Rising 20,000 feet high, almost to the roof of the world, Alexander chooses one of the toughest routes for his 30,000-strong army.
During the going over the Hindu Kush, inclement weather, whether it was freezing rain, snow, blizzards, would have made things very difficult to impossible for anybody but Alexander the Great. At elevation, the oxygen is thinner. It takes a lot more effort to go a lot shorter distance at that elevation.
The pass is so narrow in places, the army marches in a single file that stretches for 10 miles. Alexander's iron determination is the only thing that keeps the men on the move.
That if you're going to accomplish great things with an army as an instrument, that army has to be absolutely willing to do whatever you ask them to do. And if you consider, even for a moment, what it was that Alexander asked his army to do, it was ludicrous. Why would they do that? Well, it's because they had an extremely tight bond with him.
But over time, this bond is put to the test. In order to add fresh troops to his army, Alexander recruits Persian soldiers to fill the ranks. This proves very unpopular with the Greeks.
I must stress this isn't just a military decision, it's also a social matter. When the day's over, they dismount, they walk into the tent to have a drink, and what do they find? They find an Iranian barbarian to them propping up the bar and having a drink in the same tent with them. They don't like it. Soldiers can be very racist.
Their resentment grows worse as Alexander's character takes a dark turn. When the army reaches the fabled city of Samarkand, a lavish banquet is held. Alexander's erratic behavior is compounded by his bouts of heavy drinking, and alcohol seems to fuel his megalomania. One of the guests is Clytus, who served under Alexander's father Philip and saved Alexander's life in battle. As the wine flows, the mood turns ugly. Alexander begins boasting that his deeds are far more heroic than his father's. An angry Clytus listens in silence, then finally shouts out, "All your glory is due to your father." A drunk Alexander seizes a spear, kills his friend, and collapses in tears.
What upset Alexander, particularly by what Clytus said, was really two sorts of things. One, that Philip was much more important than Alexander was allowing to appear. In other words, Alexander's propaganda machine had gone into overdrive, and he, Alexander, had done it.
What Alexander wants now is all-consuming control over his men.
He wanted the men and the officers to bow down, blow him a kiss. The officers would then be given a kiss in return to show they were his social equals. Macedonians had nothing to do with kissing.
To the Greeks, only the gods should be worshipped like this. Many refuse to obey Alexander. One of them is Callisthenes, the man who had created the myth of Alexander.
And Callisthenes thought this was slavish, this was barbarian, this was a betrayal of Greek custom. And he thought that Alexander now was becoming an outright tyrant and a despot.
A ruthless Alexander has Callisthenes tortured and killed.
The Alexander probably became a victim of his own success. And maybe he internalized more than ever, increasingly more of his own deity, his own megalomania. And after a while, those feelings of grandeur probably influenced the way he conducted his campaigns and interacted with his soldiers.
By the 8th year of his campaign, Alexander has conquered Egypt, Persia, and the peoples of Central Asia. Alexander's empire stretched from Greece to Afghanistan and covered nearly 2 million square miles. Now he heads farther east to the ends of the known world, where the exotic and mysterious land of India lies.
He would have gone east. This is the route, the invasion route that the Persians used to conquer their part of India. As heir to the Persian Empire, he wanted that, so he went the route of armies before him and armies certainly after him through the Khyber Pass.
Alexander arrives in a place of such mystery, all the rules have changed. He is confronted by a powerful Raja who is determined to stop him. The Indians have amassed an army of 50,000 men, and they have a terrifying new weapon, 200 war elephants. At 9 feet high and weighing up to 5 tons, elephants were the battle tanks of ancient warfare. They could charge their enemy and trample them underfoot. Alexander quickly realizes he cannot risk a head-on attack against such a massive force.
He has this ability to plan and size up distribution and space, to always maintain an element of deception about his own intentions, move to the right when he's actually going to cut to the left, feint a sham crossing of the river in India, and then cross at a point where they're not expecting.
With this surprise attack, Alexander's men used their long spears to rile the elephants.
In the middle were the elephants being enraged by the spears and the arrows that were piercing their hides. Now, in that situation, the elephants, frenzied with fear and pain, turned on the Indians as much as they turned on the Greeks.
After one of the toughest battles of Alexander's career, the Indian army is wiped out and the Raja surrenders. But in a surprising move, Alexander is so impressed by his bravery, he gives the Raja back his kingdom. The legend of Alexander is now firmly rooted in Indian soil.
Alexander the Great lives on in India in many different ways. Indians view Alexander as this great heroic character who pervades their entire sense of history. Now you see Alexander's legacies kind of come through in pretty much everything that India has done. Its very much evident in Indian literature, in Indian sculpture and paintings. So even today you go to Northwest India and you'll see Indian gods striking Grecian poses, because these were, the sculptors were influenced by Greek art.
Alexander was making his mark on India. But despite his great victory, the long years of fighting have taken their toll on his army. To make matters worse, the monsoon rains relentlessly set in.
It would be psychologically terrible for the men from Macedonia, because they had never known anything like it.
After 8 years and 17,000 miles, the troops reach breaking point and refuse to go any farther. Alexander has lost his first battle against his own men. He has no choice but to turn back.
But just think of it, here he was going to be, before he was 30, standing, he believed, at the point where the world ran out into a vast great sea of water. And he was going to stand and look out, and he was going to sacrifice to the gods that his divine father had told him to sacrifice to. And he was going to think, back in your hole, Philip, you never got so far. Oh, come on, you know, it's egocentric. But what a name, what a name. And they'd gone and denied it. Wimps.
Alexander takes the long way back to Persia, leading his troops on yet another epic march. This time through the barren wasteland of a desert, one of the driest places on earth. Why Alexander came this way is a mystery. Perhaps it was to punish his men for not following him to the ends of the earth.
The terrain changed dramatically from hard-baked ground where nothing grew to a shifting desert sand which buried his army up to their waist and above.
Thousands die from sunstroke, thirst, and exhaustion. Less than a third of Alexander's army survive.
He thought that he could conquer anything. So far, he had conquered everything in his path. And he thought he could handle it. And he was wrong.
And while it is the worst disaster of the entire campaign, it's still a marvel that they crossed at all.
They never really quite knew towards the end what Alexander would do next. His actions and his policies were unfathomable. He was unpredictable and threatening to them in that sense.
Alexander marches on to the Persian city of Susa, where he has another surprise in store for his men. He commands nearly 100 Macedonian officers to take Persian brides.
These marriages were meant to stay in place. They were meant to go and inseminate these women and produce an endless number of hybrid Macedonian Iranian children who are going to be the princes of the future.
The marriages are deeply resented by the men, and their anger grows. But for Alexander, merging East and West is a practical affair. He himself makes a point of marrying 3 foreign women. In order to rule a diverse empire, he needs to fuse the cultures.
He's looking forward now to the new empire, not the one that he's conquered, not the one he brought with him from Greece and Macedon, but the new Middle Eastern empire.
Alexander marches his army back to the new seat of his empire, Babylon. On a hot night, after a bout of heavy drinking, he falls mysteriously ill his concerned Macedonian officers gather around his deathbed. After 11 feverish days, he dies at the age of 32. What killed Alexander? Was it disease? Was it alcohol? Or was it murder? Some experts say it was typhoid. Others think he was poisoned by a group of his officers, tired of his rages and his desire to be worshipped as a god. But for centuries, historians have debated the cause of death.
I'm sure of one thing, Alexander wasn't poisoned. The final fatal dinner party is dated May 29th. His death is the 10th, 11th of June. If you were going to poison Alexander, you'd have given him a massive dose. So what did kill him? Well, it can't be an epidemic. It's not that masses of other people died around him. It's not some kind of Asian flu. It must be something specific to him. I rally to malaria.
Alexander's body can't be examined because it's missing. On its way back to Macedonia, his funeral procession was ambushed by one of Alexander's generals who wanted to take the body to Egypt. For centuries, Alexander's body lay in the city of Alexandria.
It was probably one of the most sacred relics in the Roman Empire. Alexander became worshipped as a god after his death in a very serious way.
Julius Caesar came to pay homage to his dead hero. The Roman Emperor Augustus laid a golden crown on the coffin and scattered flowers over the corpse. But in the 4th century AD, something happened, and the tomb disappeared. Since then, Alexander's tomb is one of archaeology's holy grails. Some experts believe it could have been destroyed by war, or even earthquakes. But one British historian has a more startling theory. Andrew Chugg believes a clue to its whereabouts lies in a 16th century map.
In its exact center, there is a building, a small building, that could be the chapel, with the minaret of a mosque beside it, which is labeled Domus Alexandri Magni, which is Latin for the house of Alexander the Great.
It was here that a sarcophagus was located. It was meant for the Egyptian pharaoh Nectanebo II, but he was never entombed there. Is this where Alexander was laid to rest? The sarcophagus was rediscovered by Napoleon in the 19th century. But when he was defeated by the British, the empty sarcophagus was moved to London. Today it rests in the British Museum.
This thing may have been touched by the remains of Alexander the Great. When you think Julius Caesar may have been there, Augustus Caesar may have been there, Napoleon probably touched this thing, you get an almost electric thrill from it.
But the British Museum doesn't accept Chugg's idea. Any DNA evidence to support the claim is no longer there. And so the search continues to find the conqueror's body, buried somewhere under the shifting desert sands. Or perhaps, as some believe, beneath the city he named after himself, Alexandria. Although Alexander's body may be lost to history, his legacy still lives. His brilliant war tactics are studied at military colleges today.
There are ways or patterns of thought and action that become apparent in studying Alexander's generalship. And those patterns are as applicable in the modern day world as they were in Alexander's time.
A top commander is responsible for thousands of lives and must possess vision, discipline, and the unshakable confidence of his troops. Alexander the Great was a charismatic leader who could rally his men on their long campaign. His ability to connect with his soldiers earned him fierce loyalty on the battlefield. Whatever he demanded of his men, Alexander would do himself, leading the charge and sharing the dangers.
He was out there meeting with the lowest level of his troops. He knew many of them by their names. They had been on the campaign for so long. And that bonded people to him.
Over the centuries, military commanders have relied on Alexander's battle-proven strategies. The Roman emperors were inspired by the autocratic Alexander. They loved him because he achieved what others thought was impossible. When Julius Caesar reached the age of 32, he reportedly wept at the thought that his accomplishments were not as great as those of Alexander's.
It's clear that, like so many other Romans, Julius Caesar had an Alexander complex. He suffered from Alexander envy. All Romans did.
One of the ancient world's greatest generals, Hannibal, was also influenced by Alexander. Both were driven by a hatred of an old enemy. Alexander wanted to punish the Persians, and Hannibal the Romans. And in revolutionary America, George Washington's military strategy owed a lot to Alexander.
Washington, in everything he did, you could actually trace the origins to Alexander the Great. The crossing of the Delaware is exactly a replica in terms of the strategies and tactics of Alexander the Great's battle at the Hydaspes.
In December 1776, General Washington led his ragged troops across the frozen Delaware River to attack the British. Their unexpected victory at Trenton became a turning point in the American War for Independence. As a schoolboy, the Corsican general Napoleon Bonaparte was fascinated by legends of Alexander the Great. Napoleon's ruthless ambition quickly propelled him through the army ranks. Like Alexander, he built his power on a series of daring military victories.
At the first opportunity, he followed in the footsteps of Alexander on his voyage to Egypt. He was most of all impressed by Alexander's religious policy, the way in which he adapted to whatever the circumstances were and adopted the point of view in whatever country he was present in.
In 1802, the French people voted him consul for life, and just 2 years later, Napoleon was crowned emperor. Like Alexander, Napoleon inspired total loyalty from his men. They both got to know their soldiers by name and rewarded them for their bravery on the battlefield.
When Napoleon was contemplating his invasion of Russia, he was thinking of Alexander because of the distances involved.
But unlike Alexander, Napoleon would face a painful defeat in battle and ultimate exile. Whatever his fate, Napoleon, like Alexander, was convinced he was a man of destiny. He believed that in warfare, men were nothing, but one man could win the day. George S. Patton, World War II general, was a commander cut from the same mold as Alexander.
From his very earliest days at West Point, George Patton admired the exploits of all the classical heroes, but in particular Alexander the Great. And there are several writings and notebooks that indicate that Patton did want to emulate the glories of Alexander past.
Like his idol, Patton studied his enemies for weaknesses. He could then work out the best way to beat them.
His hero was Alexander, and what he most admired him for was the discipline that he instilled in his troops.
Patton, like Alexander, seemed to be able to achieve what no other general could. In a bold move in 1944, a confident Patton switched the direction of his force, turning 100,000 men from the east to the north. Marching 100 miles in 3 days, they attacked the Germans. After 3 weeks of brutal fighting in what history calls the Battle of the Bulge, Patton's huge gamble paid off. Patton was welcomed home as a great general, but he still fell short of his hero, Alexander.
He is the gold standard for all times, for good and for ill. And this is what makes him such an attractive, in a sense, almost an irresistible icon for anybody who aspires to leadership and greatness.
The art of war is only one part of Alexander's legacy. He also created new trade routes and forged cultural relationships between East and West.
Well, what Alexander does is indeed spread Greek culture, so that Greek tragedy is performed in what's now Iran. Greek philosophy makes its way ultimately through India all the way down to Sri Lanka. It's an amazing cultural fertilization.
But above all, he is hailed as one of the most exceptional military leaders that ever lived. Alexander the Great has become a symbol of unbridled ambition and colossal achievement.
The courage, his intrepid nature, his spontaneity, the type of loyalty which he inspired, he was an incredible man by any stretch of the imagination.
Alexander the Great was a legendary leader, obsessed with his own myth. 2,500 years later, we are still talking about his amazing exploits. In the end, Alexander got just what he wanted.